Absolutely, Gabrielle. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Tom Cormier, and I'm the President and CEO of Parliamentary Centre. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have lived, cared for, and protected these lands from time immemorial. So very excited to have a very experienced panel today to talk about a really pressing issue that we spend a lot of time thinking about in our ongoing series sponsored and supported by the US Embassy in Ottawa that explores contemporary issues to democratic development and challenges us to think of new ways to approach defending democracy against threats that we see more persistent and more pervasive these days. I'm just fresh off a call this morning with Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, where a number of Canadian academics and practitioners in democratic support touched upon the issues we're going to talk about today. I know the minister is extremely interested in this discussion, and we're going to be sharing information about this with her and her office afterwards. So very excited about today's activities, and I'm very pleased to introduce Carrie Buck, one of our board members, who will be taking over from me and being our host today. So thank you so much for your participation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Is Carrie there?
No, I don't see, I don't see her, but.
Is Carrie by chance one of the Gabrielles?
Probably.
It's possible, but perhaps as we identify the issue for Carrie, Marcy, are you able to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I am no Carrie Buck, but a pleasure to step in a pinch. My name is Marcy Sirks. I too am a director with the Parliamentary Centre, very recently minted as such, and grateful to be part of this afternoon. On behalf of the Parliamentary Centre and Carrie, we just wanted to underscore a few of the same thoughts that Tom was alluding to, that this is in fact a deeply critical moment for security, and in particular, as we'll explore this afternoon, that gender dynamic is extremely prominent, extremely important to focus on. And I just got a signal that Carrie is in fact here. So I will just say that I will be assisting Carrie in facilitating this conversation later on this afternoon. And so I look forward to speaking with you a little bit later, but over to Carrie to do the opening statement.
My sincere apologies for the delay, and Marcy, you were doing great. You can continue, but I'll just be very, very brief. So I've had the honor, I guess, of working on the issue of women, peace and security and gender-based violence from the beginning, when the international community started to focus on the issue in the early 90s. And I have to say that from that beginning period, Canada's been one of a small group of countries with the US that has driven, and Sweden and a few others, has driven the international agenda. And today, from those early beginnings, feminist approaches to national security have a much broader group of states supporting the agenda internationally, and the analysis of what a feminist approach means in theory and in practice has become much more sophisticated. But I guess the main message is there's still a lot of work to be done. So we'll hear from our three US experts today on their experience in defining, advocating, and implementing a feminist approach to national security. And then we hope to, in the Q&A session, draw some lessons from their experience for our own work on national security, including renewal of Canada's National Action Plan, explore the intersection between security and feminist approaches to democracy, gender disinformation, and anything else that the people participating in the seminar want to bring up in the public Q&A session. So without further ado, I will start by introducing Lyric Thompson. Lyric is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Center for Research on Women in DC. She advocates with the US government and internationally, and she's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, where she teaches a course on women's rights advocacy. I think, Lyric, you're going to be very busy in the US for the next while. And I will, with that, pass over to you.
You should have seen us for the last 4 years before that.
Yeah.
Just to acknowledge, thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you, Gabrielle, Ambassador Buck, and all for your efforts on this conversation, which I'm eager to be a part of. I do, and I should say, I'm actually calling in from Raleigh, North Carolina, which is Lumbee land. And as we are the day after the International Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, I did want to also acknowledge that history. The Lumbee tribe is actually still does not have federal recognition in the United States. And so I'm grateful to the caretakers of that land, past and present. I do want to also acknowledge that I'm feeling a little sheepish coming to this conversation as a US expert, when a lot of the work that I do on feminist foreign policy generally has been very much informed by the Canadian leadership and experience. And so I've been very grateful to be a part of a number of the consultations on your emerging white paper on feminist foreign policy, as well as dating back to your feminist international assistance approaches, and your ambassador for women, peace and security, Jacqueline O'Neill, was a fellow advocate in Washington for a long time in a coalition on women, peace and security. So I very much feel that I'm coming to this conversation not as an expert, but as a partner in learning. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit about what I've learned in that work. So the International Center for Research on Women has been very interested in the field of feminist foreign policy, which, as I mentioned, is where we've done most of our focus. I know we're talking specifically today about security policy and about democracy assistance, and I'm happy to drill down. But our expertise has been on helping to shape an emerging framework and definition for what feminist foreign policy is, that then informs those various levers, as well as others, on issues such as trade, diplomacy more broadly, immigration policy, and the like. So we've been very interested in feminist foreign policy since 2014, when Sweden became the first country to announce an explicitly feminist foreign policy, which, as I'm sure you know, was definitional in its approach to what they have handily distilled to a mnemonic device, the 3 R's: rights, resources, and representation. They were rather lonely for quite some time, and in efforts even in North America and Canada, and certainly in the United States, which, for the record, has not expressed formally an interest in a feminist foreign policy, although we're working on that. There was very much a response of, well, we can't all be Sweden. And then in subsequent years, starting very much with the Canadian FIOP, Feminist International Assistance Policy, in 2017. And as I mentioned, your really impressive consultative process as you develop a larger approach to a feminist foreign policy, which I hope to read the white paper about soon. I have been very grateful to an expansion of that framework beyond a focus on mostly women, to a more intersectional approach, which is the approach that the International Center for Research on Women espouses, which is to say, looking at intersecting issues of race and ethnicity, of ability, of rurality, of caste, of class, of various pieces, again, in the United States in particular. And I think looking at some of the examples in Europe, we think that migratory status and immigration policy is very much a part of this conversation. And then in the last 4 years, there's really just been an explosion of countries interested in this work. Many from Europe, yes. So Luxembourg, France, Spain, Scotland, and this year, Germany. But also, and this is very important in the work that we're doing, from the global South. So Mexico, Libya, and Chile at this point. So from all of that work, we have looked at what each country has published or put publicly available and worked with diplomats and government representatives in those countries to look at things that may not be publicly available in terms of how they're crafting their approaches. We've also consulted with more than 200 organizations around the world of feminist activists, academics, scholars, and implementers as to what they think feminist foreign policy should be. We've distilled a definition that I'm going to read. It's a little wordy, but there's several things that we're trying to do with this definition that are germane to this conversation. So please bear with me as I read you a few sentences. For us, in what we've learned, feminist foreign policy is the policy of a state that defines its interactions not only with states, but also with movements and other non-state actors in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. This piece is important. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all levers of influence, anchored by the exercise of those values at home and accountable to the same feminist principles at home and abroad. So there's a few things we're trying to do here with this definition, building on the 3 R's framework. Of course, we've added research and learning, which Canada has, again, been instrumental in your feminist monitoring, learning, and evaluation frameworks. But the importance of that matter of policy coherence. So not just the traditional soft power approaches, but really applying the same lens to defense policy, to trade policy, and I've already mentioned immigration. We have a specific agenda that we have distilled for the United States, which seems germane to this conversation, and in some of the preparatory conversation with the organizers and my fellow co-panelists, we determined that our memo that we've written to the Biden administration about what we would like the United States to do in this area would be useful to share with you, because while they have not officially indicated an interest in a feminist foreign policy, you'll see that actually a number of the folks who have gone into the Biden-Harris administration were actually on our steering committee of our coalition pushing for this. So the White House Gender Policy Council Director, Jen Klein, the now Undersecretary for Nuclear and Arms Non-Proliferation, Bonnie Jenkins. So it's really inspiring to see these diverse feminist leaders who have gone into government that we know have been on the record in supporting this vision and are doing what they can to implement it. So what would that look like specifically in the field of security? Certainly a military posture that is defensive primarily in nature, that takes intervention incredibly seriously, goes through all methods of civil comment and oversight, UN engagement, et cetera, before ever intervening, views that as a last resort, looks to draw down its own nuclear arms store, as well as work toward nuclear non-proliferation. I think we can all agree that what we're seeing in terms of the current efforts and conversations in Ukraine is the proof point and the case in which we would like to see feminist approaches to foreign policy succeed. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to get into some of these additional recommendations as of interest in the further Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyric. We're going to then turn to Lucina DiMeco. And Lucina is a gender equality expert and women's rights advocate, and she was the co-founder of She Persisted, which is an organization dedicated to tackling gendered disinformation against women in politics. She is widely published in 5 different languages, but I think today, Lucina, you'll be gracing us with your English and not Italian. But we really look forward to hearing you, particularly on disinformation. It's quite salient now, not just because of disinformation around the Ukraine war, but it's something we're tackling right now. So Lucina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm so happy to be here, particularly having a conversation on the importance of gender disinformation in the context of national security. I think by now we have understood the relevance of looking at digital harms against women in politics in particular, as a form of violence. We have not very often understood, or not understood enough, the relevance and importance of talking about gender disinformation and digital harms as a national security threat. And indeed, they are. Gender disinformation is really the overwhelming amount of fake and misleading information and images, particularly against women in politics and women leaders, that we see happening all over the world. And this is something that's, very problematic and has very important consequences for the women they're targeted. Certainly their mental health, certainly their political effectiveness. But the truth is that the impact goes well beyond. We see gender disinformation being used by illiberal actors, by authoritarians, to actually undermine women's rights activists, undermine political opponents in general, and really silence certain most salient agendas that very often women leaders are the spokespeople for. We are talking about human rights agendas, immigration, climate, some of the most important issues of our time. So I'm thrilled that we are really looking at gender disinformation in the context of a conversation on national security. Why is gender disinformation really a threat to national security? Again, we have seen certain political actors, including in certain countries, really using fake images and learning from one another's playbook to attack women political leaders and silence them. So to make an example, the Green Party candidate in Germany, Annalena Baerbock, was actually targeted with very typical gender disinformation campaigns that started with fake nude images of her circulating online. And that alone, together with the onslaught of other disinformative narratives against her, conspirational narratives that were multiple times more prevalent against her than against her the male candidates, that alone really had an impact on her campaign, where she lost dozens of points within a few months. The finding that Russian sources, Russian inauthentic actors were behind a fair amount of those attacks is very interesting, because then it really leads us to understand what's behind those attacks. Very often we talk about misogyny being behind the attacks against women in politics. I think it's actually much deeper than that, and much scarier in some ways. So we aren't talking about the misogynist next door sending a negative tweet or sending an insult. We're talking about entire campaigns that are very well organized, very well resourced, really to undermine certain political agendas. The fact that Annalena Baerbock was the Green Party candidate, and she was really pushing for less reliance on Russian gas in Germany, is not by chance that then she was the one that was most targeted. And all over the world, we find women in politics really being the spokespeople around some of those thorniest issues. They are the most powerful advocates and defenders, if you want, really human rights, as well as fighting against autocracies. And it's not by chance that they're being targeted. And this one, for example, using fake nude photos or videos, is a playbook that has been used to silence and push women out of politics, from Ukraine to Iraq to Brazil to Germany. So it's really a global threat to countries' democracy, and to countries' really ability to have a political discourse. I think we have seen this happening even in Canada. We have seen the horrific, really campaigns targeting Catherine McKenna. And it's not by chance. She was really a very outspoken climate leader. Over and over again, she was, being the face of climate action, and the targeting of her and the making it so hard for her to bring forward the messages, the very important messages that she had to bring forward, really was not by chance. So we are seeing misogyny being weaponized for political purposes, and I think it's really important to recognize that. One other thing I think is also really important to recognize is that more often than not, digital platforms want us to think of this issue in the context of misogyny. They want to claim that because they did not invent misogyny, there is nothing that they can do against the online harms that women in politics receive. Now, over and over, actually, we have seen, and it has been reported through whistleblowers, it has been reported through various, leaks, that in fact there is much more that the companies could do and they are deciding not to do because they do not want to rock the boat with various illiberal actors. They do not want to lose users that bring them, in fact, a lot of money. They bring them a lot of profit. The more toxic the posts, the more money goes to social media platforms through advertising, because those are the posts that are going to be generating most outrage and are going to be replicated the most. So I think that if there is something I want to leave us all considering after this conversation, is really to understand that we need to hold social media platforms accountable in a way that's very different than has been done so far. We need governments to truly step up, and I know that Canada had been considering legislation in this area. We definitely need Canada to step up in this area too, because it really does represent, if you want, a beacon of hope for other countries too. In many ways, they have opportunities to be more ahead in legislation than the US. We have seen important legislation happening in the European Union, and we definitely need to go in that direction of demanding more from social media platforms, because our democracy is at risk. It's not only about the harms that women are receiving, and the harms that women are receiving should be enough, because 50% of the population is not a minor element, but it's also really about democracy.
Thank you very much, Lucina. And I will now pass to Rollie Lal, who is an assistant professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs. She teaches courses on transnational security, foreign policy, international political economy. She's also co-chair of the Global Affairs and Religion Network, and she has extensive research on a broad range of security and economic issues as well. So without further ado, I will pass to you. Thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk in particular about the importance of feminism in national security and how that can be seen in particular through what I would call three different arenas, especially looking at this Russia and Ukraine conflict right now. One is ideology, then the violence against women and refugees, and thirdly, the gender disparities between this conflict and other conflicts recently. So first off, just looking at ideology, it's I think a really interesting dynamic that is happening in Russia today. It's interesting to note that two of the thinkers who influence Putin very much have emphasized self-sacrifice. And this really does lead to the rollback in human rights. These two thinkers, Alexander Dugin and Gumilev, they favor a Russian empire, a sort of right-wing, somewhat fascist ideologies. Dugin, for example, favors a Russian empire from Dublin to Vladivostok. And Gumilev believed in a martial nationalism that emphasizes self-sacrifice for the state. So I think what we need to realize is that Russia's foreign policy today, right now in this context, is not meant to be inclusive or democratic. And this tendency for self-sacrifice of the individual, it can be seen directly in this war right now against Ukraine, where women and children and Ukrainian sentiments are being sacrificed for supposedly the good of the greater Russian state. So secondly, if you look at the issue of the women themselves who are fleeing Ukraine, we need to consider two things about the violence that is happening. One, how rape is being used as a weapon of war, and secondly, the issue of the sex trafficking. So right now, what we are seeing is that the International Criminal Court and human rights groups are saying that Russians are using rape as a systematic weapon of war. And in many cases, gang rape is happening in the areas that the Russians have come through. In just early April alone, we know that around Kiev, there were more than 400 calls about rapes, and we're expecting to hear much more. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And it's, you know, quite difficult, of course, to protect women from this when you have you know, conflict going on in this way and the Russians coming through. There is no way to just protect the women in particular. Some organizations have been given contraceptives to prevent pregnancies. Some other possibilities to think about would be to have rape kits available so that some sort of accounting can be done for this afterwards. Also, what we're seeing is that the Russians are calling the women Nazi whores and being told that these rapes will make sure that they will not be able to reproduce more Nazi or Ukrainians. And so this is really being used as a weapon of war against women. In terms of sex trafficking, we know that there are traffickers, or not necessarily Russians now. We're just seeing the entry of organized crime into this arena in a very dangerous way, taking advantage of these refugees. And we're seeing traffickers, human traffickers, posing as volunteers, wearing official vests to trick women into thinking that these are official, you know, refugee handlers. And they're doing this to traffic the women. Then they're also inviting women and girls with job offers, because of course these populations are so vulnerable. They're looking for any type of work. And so when they see these job offers, they're very vulnerable. They're being sold for sex. They're sometimes even being sold for organ trafficking. Some possible options in that arena are that women could be taking photos of the cars and license plates of the car they're getting into and send that out to their family or friends before getting in. And I think the last arena I'd like to touch upon is the fact that gender disparities exist between this conflict and refugees from other recent conflicts, such as in Syria and Iraq, or when we talk about the African refugees coming through Libya into Europe. And what we are seeing in terms of numbers is something along the lines of, in the Ukrainian conflict, where we know that the men are need to stay behind, are forced to stay behind. And so we're seeing predominantly women and children and maybe some elderly males leaving the Ukraine. So it's a very predominantly female refugee population leaving. And with the other conflicts, Syria and so forth, what we saw is the refugee population entering Europe was approximately 70% male. And that is the same for refugees coming through from Africa, through Libya into Europe and so forth. And what that means is that we need to think, policymakers need to think about what are the implications of these gender disparities in terms of national security, both for the receiving countries as well as for the exit countries. So for example, of course, the safety of the women and children who are refugees entering Europe. What type of security do we set in place to make sure that they are secure against traffickers so that they have jobs and so forth? On the other hand, when we are talking about predominantly male populations entering Europe, we actually do have to sometimes think about the security of the women in the existing host countries. Because when we have a demographic where there is predominantly more men, especially young single men, we do have to think about instability. And so when we're looking at this, we have to think about both the host country and the exiting country. When we're looking at Syria and so forth, you see a lot of female refugees landed in Jordan or Lebanon and areas like that. Again, you have to think about the safety, security of those women. We have to think of policies that may possibly allow for a better gender distribution of refugees into entry countries. How do we do that? Do we talk about family reunification? Do we restrict entry to certain genders? These are all issues that I think we really need to talk about. And we also have to think about, of course, the reconstruction of a country where women have left. And with that, I will end here and move to more discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'll kick off with the first question, but just there was, Rollie, to respond to yours, there was actually a quote that I saw, and I haven't double checked it, from Putin saying that he was outraged at the US response, their Russia policy post 2014, and that the US Russia policy was mostly led by women inside the administration, Obama's administration. So Toria Nuland, Wendy Sherman, all those people who are leading from higher level positions inside state right now. So if he was mad then, he might be madder now. And it is, you know, anger at this, women directing policy against Russia. It's interesting gendered analysis. Sorry, I digress. So I'm gonna just launch off and ask the panelists how you see the intersection between security and democracy. So any lessons that you've learned in applying a gendered approach to security, how can they help close a gender gap in democracy, which that gender gap in democracy has actually increased over the course of the pandemic. So the progress that was going like this started to go like that again. So I'll turn over to our panelists to weigh in on that. Who's up first? You can wave a hand. Or I'll voluntold someone. Lyra. Excellent, Lucina, thank you.
I can just very briefly talk about the digital harms side of this, and I'm looking forward to hear other speakers' perspective on those different pieces. So for us, we see it actually really very, very clearly. The fact that women are not really able to express themselves freely online limits their really opportunity in taking part in the political arena in so many ways. The fact that they have to fear for what they're going to say online because there is evidence that they're going to be attacked regardless of what they say, up to 10 times more. We have very interesting data from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue that looked at the US Democratic congressional races and saw that women were attacked, in fact, 10 times more on Facebook than their male colleagues. When we see this type of data, we really have to wonder about how then possible it is for those women to, in fact, be successful and how willing they are. Over and over, wherever we have statistics being done around the disincentives for women to enter the political arena, we hear from young women that actually social media represents the #1 disincentive. So when we think about strength of our democracy, we have to think about that. Young women are really being concerned that, you know, whatever they posted at some point on Facebook with their friends might be used against them. And this is in and of itself representing a disincentive. They see how women in politics are being treated online, and you know, they are thinking, I wouldn't want that for myself. We did an event last year here with the Canadian public, with the Montreal Institute for Studies of Genocide, and what we did hear from women that has been candidates was that, in fact, the amount of online hate, the disinformation against them, the gaslighting, the insults against them and their families, and the actual threats that they received online made it so that they would never want to consider a political career again, and they were discouraging their own daughters and the young women they knew from considering a political career. So I think that this is really the threat that we are up against, and we must be able to provide better answers, because again, this level of online insecurity and unsafety and threats against women rights activists does have very important negative consequences on democracy.
Before I turn to our other two panelists to weigh in on this, there was a question in the chat about concrete measures you might take to manage the cross-border flow of gender disinformation.
So this is a global threat that needs to be responded to with global strategies. And a fair amount of those strategies, in fact, are grounded in better policies. I do not think that this is a problem that we will get out of simply by building more digital resilience on our side. It's like trying to empty the sea with a teacup. The policies that the social media platforms have brought up have been insufficient at best. More often than not, actually, I would say they have been harmful. If we look at the commitments that the social media platforms took within the last Generation Equality Forum at the UN, in fact, for example, one of their commitments was to actually allow women to limit certain words so that they would not have to see them in their dashboard. So if someone would insult you with a specific insult, you wouldn't have to see that insult. Mind you, everyone else around you would still see it. You can still block a person, and again, in many countries for women political leaders, you can't, because you can be sued for blocking someone and limiting their freedom of speech. So even in those countries where you can block them, but everyone else around is going to see them. So this is the type of commitments we see coming from digital platforms. We definitely do need more and better, and it needs to come through policies and legislation. I really am hopeful in what I have seen written in terms of potential accountability through the Digital Services Act, for example, in Europe. What I think we though still need to do is to make sure that those policies do have a gender lens that is very often missing when it comes to implementation. And that's why women end up being left out, because the legislators most often, particularly when it comes to technology, aren't really thinking of the real impact of technology on women. They're thinking in very abstract terms. It isn't an abstract issue. I will just say one number that I think is going to, be quite shocking to everyone, and at the same time make sense. When we think about deep fakes, when we hear conversations about deep fakes, most often you hear, concerns for what might happen in the future with this or that president speech being faked. Well, 96% of existing deep fakes feature known women in acts of non-consensual pornography. So this is the reality that we're dealing with. It's not the future. It's not, some abstract political threat. This is the actual reality that women leaders are living.
Thank you. Lyric or Rollie, do you want to weigh in on this issue around the intersection between security and democracy? Any lessons learned for us, Rollie?
Sure, I just jump in and mention that I think one of the key problems that we need to think about is that national security is usually constructed in a way that people think of it as the state. They think of national security as state security. And I think this in and of itself is the critical mistake. Because when we think of national security and democracy, we need to think about the individual. We are securing the security of the individuals inside that country. We need to think about, how do we re-rank the hierarchy here so that we don't necessarily have the state and then all the individuals, including women and other minorities and religious minorities and ethnic minorities and LGBTQ, communities and everyone as kind of an afterthought. When we think of security, we need to think, okay, how are we securing the lives of our citizens? how are we making sure that they are reaching the potential that they can, that they have equality, that they have freedoms, that they have respect. And once we have achieved that for the population of the country, economic opportunities and so forth, then we know that we have achieved national security, not simply by defeating the enemy in a military conflict. And I think that is something that really needs to be internalized by leaders around the world, that it is not simply through military conquest that we have achieved national security. It is by actually respecting the individuals inside the state that we're discussing.
I'd love to piggyback on that, because I think that's where my mind was going. And to name some discomfort, rather, in the work that we're doing on conceptualizing a feminist approach to foreign policy, inclusive of security policy, inclusive of democracy assistance, I think one of the really important pieces of that for me is the line about using power analysis to disrupt, using a feminist approach to disrupt not only sexist and patriarchal power structures on both the giving and receiving ends of our foreign policy, but also racist, colonial, and other intersecting isms that I think are what is really sounding an alarm for me in this moment, which is to say, when we're having conversations about feminist approaches to security policy, absolutely, we need to be focusing on sexual and gender-based violence in the way that we've just articulated. However, I think if we overlay that conversation against a traditionally, historically colonial and racist foreign policy framework, we run the risk of a situation in which we are concerned overwhelmingly about the benefit of, or the status or the security of some kinds of women, as opposed to all of the people who are being disenfranchised, who are experiencing institutionalized violence. In this case, the preferencing of Ukrainian women and children over other ethnicities and protracted conflicts in Africa and the Middle East and North Africa. Particularly, I'm concerned about the immigration flow conversation on top of already racist immigration policies. Because I think that we miss, if we're talking feminist approaches, we miss an opportunity to broaden our aperture there and to think about who we are disenfranchising, why, whose voices we're listening to. I think it is possible to imagine interventions that take a slightly more expansive and equitable approach. For me, I think that particularly what I'm concerned about in the Ukrainian context is, because this is Russia, we're seizing upon this kind of Cold War landscape that is driving more attention and resources in this case than in some others. And I worry about that very deeply, particularly as I think about even just the way we, for the United States, I participate a lot of the times. ICRW will host, at least when we had travel before COVID, there would often be these democracy delegations where they would bring, the State Department would bring women from largely Africa, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, to Washington to hear from the experts in democracy and in our shining example of our city on the Hill. And there was almost never a program in which we experts were invited to learn from these women who were forming governments after conflict, who were organizing peace marches and peace movements. And so I think that we run the risk of having the current conversation not remembering that these are definitely Cold War structures in which we have created these programs and this posture that underlies everything that we do, that assumes that we have the knowledge, we have the thing to teach, and a bit of primacy of this Western world and, you know, the bugaboo of Russia. And Russia is definitely demonstrating that they are an adversary that very much needs our attention. But I just think we need to do some self-interrogation as we plan our responses along these other lines. Sorry to be a little long-winded on that response.
No, absolutely. Tons of food for thought. And I really thank you all for the thoughtful answers. I'm going to ask my last question and then turn over to Marcy to manage the rest of the session. So from my experience, diplomacy and effective international programming often depend on bridging divides. So when you are engaging in advocacy, norm building or programming, what tools, what language, what approaches have you found useful when you're dealing with countries or with groups that don't self-identify as feminist? And this comes from I had one experience on female genital mutilation where we were pushing this as a human rights agenda. This is a while ago. And we had a number of groups in country say, you know what, we're actually going to get way farther with this if we frame it as a health issue. So they had to reframe it and then they could get more traction. So my question for you on the broader feminist approach to national security, how do you deal when you're dealing with groups, including in our own countries that don't identify as feminist? How does the agenda survive, for instance, democratic transitions? Just in case. Okay.
I have an actually concise answer to that I'll just say. The work that we've done on the question of feminists, we've actually done some polling on this, because in the US context, I will argue with me, in any context where you have a democratically elected government, you really need polling on how language is playing. And so the word feminist, where we've landed with that is it actually polls quite well, particularly among younger and more diverse demographics. But where we left it was, it doesn't seem to poll quite well among established folks in government. And so where we left it was, what matters is the contents and not the container. And so we are structuring this campaign for a US feminist foreign policy on the assumption that if they take all of the recommendations or most of the recommendations, but do not call it feminist, we've won. If they take almost none of the recommendations, but do call it feminist, we've lost. And so that is very much the focus of our effort. Thank you.
That's great. Rollie, you had your hand up?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say, yes, I agree completely with what Lyric just said. That's absolutely. And as someone who spends all her time working in national security and discussing security topics, I have most of the time a predominantly male audience and a lot of issues that people, you know, again, like to consider the state solution. And so for me, what I have found really effective was exactly that, not calling it feminism, but prioritizing and recentering the issues, and then instead, quite frankly, calling it national security. So as what I tend to do is I try to show the linkages of how important it is to have women, minorities, and so forth important and included in development, for example, in order to avoid instability, how this helps to, avoid recruitment into insurgencies, terrorism, how women are key in families, and again, when it comes to criminalization, drugs, all sorts of security issues. Once you centralize how women and minorities and so forth are critical in ensuring stability and security of populations and economic growth, then people say, oh yes, this is national security. Now I understand. And I think that's very important because it's true. It's not just papering it over. It's really true. You cannot have security for a country. You cannot have national security with leaving half of the population out. And so this is something that that I look at every single security issue that I look at. I say, okay, well, what are the implications if we are not being inclusive? What are the implications if we are? And once you present it that way, all the benefits of being inclusive, then you see that this is a real win for national security.
Thank you. Lucina?
And yeah, the only thing I want to add is that I think that regardless though of us calling it feminist or not, when it comes to the content of certain issues, and I fully agree the content is more important than the container, we will keep having to respond to the backlash against women's rights and against feminism, because the truth is that feminism is being used as a glue by authoritarians all over the world to put together various constituencies. So all over the world, we are seeing women's rights being diminished, attacked, and also framed in terms of, you know, feminism in a negative way. And so we see women that are fighting for climate justice, women that are bringing forward immigration issues being targeted as feminists. And, you know, we see governments somehow using this as a way to undermine women's rights, to instill fear over the loss of certain traditions. And so I definitely think we need to look at content. We also need to really look at a communication strategy, because whether we call it feminist or not, chances are those that want to diminish those issues are going to call them feminist issues as a way to, you know, undermine them.
I'm just nodding and agreeing. And with that, I will pass you over to Marcy's capable hands. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the panel so far. I'm going to take just a bit of a deeper dive question, which may be more in Lucina's bailiwick, but please feel free, Rollie and Lyric, to comment after as you see fit. I think this picks up one of the threads as well from the chat of the attendees and around disinformation specifically. Lucina, you touched on this. You said Canada needs to step up. You very clearly pointed at us and said the government needs to do more. There needs to be some form of greater regulation. And you also gave the example of the European Union, which is taking more action on this front. Canada, in cohort with its G7 allies, its Five Eyes allies, has been discussing this issue at some length, repeatedly over years, many tables, and yet action seems to be slow to come. So I wonder, Lucina, just briefly, if you could really concretize for us, what would some of those initiatives be where Canada could step up? Are we talking about an independent regulatory body? Are we talking about the criminal law? What can Canada do in the near term to help affect change in this area? There seems to be political will, but how do we action it?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. You know, we wrote actually a paper on women's disinformation, disinformation against women political candidates in Canada, that look a little bit at the time at what was a potential proposal that was being looked at in Canada, and that focused at that time on a separation between, say, legal and illegal content. We feel that this type of focus isn't necessarily helpful for the harms that women in politics are targeted with, and can in fact also backlash in many ways and be used by authoritarians in other countries to undermine women's rights activism. And so in reality, I think what Canada can do and can look at is really more issues of accountability from platforms in the form of what has been called, for example, in the UK, online safety bill, a duty of care. So risk assessment frameworks, transparency from digital platforms that should be looking at what is going on and before putting on the market tools and products, check really the consequences that those products will have on people's lives. We actually believe, and there has been actually very interesting hearings that I heard in the Canadian Parliament, where various digital platforms were asked whether they had risk assessment practices, and the answers were always quite vague. The truth is that we have seen through the Facebook files, for example, that Facebook did have risk assessment practices and studies, and when those risk assessments went in the opposite direction of where the money and the profit was going for them, they decided to overlook them. For example, they did know the negative impact that Instagram had on teen girls, and they decided to overlook that and to continue as course because that was, you know, a money generating machine. So I think that looking at those type of issues is really important. Can be done, I think, again, looking at Canada's leadership in many ways, at feminist foreign policy, or at least the attempt at looking, you know, integrating women's rights in as a whole of government agenda. I think that it is possible to hope for a leadership from Canada when it comes to those areas. And again, particularly looking at the back end, at guaranteeing that products are designed in a way that's not harmful. It isn't true that you can't do that without inflicting, if you want, on freedom of expression. It's actually the contrary. The reality is that women today are not free to express themselves online. I also really want to say, as Professor Marianne Franks always says, that in reality what we're asking here to digital platforms is nothing new, is nothing special. If you buy a bottle of water, someone has checked the content of that water to make sure that there isn't poison in there. And if there is poison in there and people being killed because they drink that water, there are consequences. We do these for industries building bridges. We do these for the chairs we're sitting on. We do not expect to buy them and then, you know, fall down and get killed and nothing happens, and them avoiding responsibilities all the time. The digital platforms is the one industry where we have allowed them to basically do whatever they want without any accountability, without any checking from any institution looking into what they're doing, and the consequences have been dire. So I think it's about time to treat them just as any other industry has been treated in our societies.
Thank you. There's a lot in there, but I'll turn to just to see if Rollie or Lyric want to add to that line of questioning.
I'll just add one thing, and this is definitely Lucina's expertise and not mine, so I'm grateful for her intervention. But just one thing to flag that I think is useful from some of the work of one of my colleagues, Dr. Laura Henson, who's worked on a framework and language that she has encouraged us to think of as technology facilitated gender-based violence. And her goal in that language is that hopefully it's helpful to conceptualize that violence as coming on and offline. It's not just the internets and they're virtual, so it's a jurisdictional issue. It's the behavior that is showing up online is actually coming offline in the form of stalking and threats and violence and aggression in person, and that hopefully that is something that will help advance slightly more accountability in the thinking of this as not just something that exclusively happens in the air, for lack of a better way to put that.
Rollie, go ahead.
I just wanted to add very quickly that I completely agree with Lucina that absolutely we should expect accountability on this product, especially it's interesting, we underestimate the power of these technologies and social media platforms. These platforms are now, more powerful than many governments, I would say, in many ways. They are influencing ideology and the way that people are thinking about so many things. So absolutely, I think that we need to hold these companies more accountable. But the question then becomes, of course, how do you hold these companies accountable when some of these companies are, again, now more powerful than, various countries maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to note, I mean, this is an extremely salient point right now, given that at least domestically, Canada has struck an expert panel to try and get the government to a point of finding some consensus after a series of public consultations, and finding that right sweet spot for the government has been obviously proving challenging. So thank you for your comments and for underscoring some of the difficulties and some very pointed potential solutions. It's very helpful. I'm going to take some of the audience questions that have come in. The first one coming from Robert, who has asked a question which I may ask Rollie to begin with, since it touches very directly on her presentation of earlier. And that is, in addition to some of the issues you raised around the sex trade in particular and women refugees, what are other higher priority issues where there can be global support to Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees in this moment?
Okay, that's a good question. So he's saying in addition to the sex trade and refugees, so other than. Okay, yeah, well, I mean, definitely, I think that we need to be thinking in terms of economic reconstruction. I think, right, it's very easy in the midst of a conflict to be very subsumed in who's giving a tank and who's giving another weapon, because they do need that type of support right now. But what happens very soon in the future is, of course, the fact that you now have a completely demolished and destitute country on our hands needs to be dealt with. And again, all of the implications of security threats for both internally, whether we're talking about health issues, we're talking about water, energy, education, roads, buildings, so forth. We need to be looking at that already, and having people thinking about, who's going to be on this and who's going to be on that. And then, of course, there's the issue of the refugees from Ukraine are, again, a different sort. Not only is it a gender difference, but also most of the refugees polled say that when possible, they would like to return. And so we have to think about that as well. When we're dealing with refugees and settlement in foreign countries, we have to think, okay, what is the most effective way to resettle and integrate people while knowing that, we're going to try to resettle them back in their country, and how are we going to do that? So there's a lot of long-term thinking that needs to be made, both in terms of reconstruction and in terms of mobilization of individuals, where they're going and where they're staying and so forth. Thanks.
Thanks, Rollie. I see, actually, we've got, I think Carrie wants to get in, and then I'll turn to the other panelists. Carrie, go ahead.
Sorry, I agree entirely that what should be happening now is some serious backroom thinking about what happens after. And I think what happens after on a few fronts, on economic reconstruction, they've just gone through COVID too. So the she session that we've felt, they've felt. And so it's going to be a double challenge when they start to rebuild their economy to ensure that they don't replicate the backsliding that women had experienced before, that they take that into account, maybe build in the opposite direction. Then on reintegration of refugees, there's going to be, because it's mostly women and children, there's going to be a whole different reintegration, psychosocial support. They're not going back to towns that they left. Totally changed society, totally changed environment. And then on justice, one of the first stops for justice for sexual violence is in-country prosecutions. It's not all ICC, right? And so you need to worry about having the proper support, the whole range of support for people so they're not re-victimized, but also that the prosecutors understand, the judges understand there's a ton of work to be done there. And finally, on democratic resilience, whatever happens, unless Russia leaves everywhere, and I don't see that happening, they're going to be continuing to destabilize democracy in Ukraine for a very long time to come, even if they just get parts of the Donbass. And so democratic resilience, I think, will be an important part. And in that democratic resilience, I go back to Lucina's point about women having to being able to participate in that democracy, because you can't have resilience with 50% of the population excluded.
Thank you. Did Lucina or Lyric want to comment on additional supports for Ukraine? Okay, I'm going to pass to another question that's come in from the audience. Looks like from Ambassador Absuli, pardon me, from the Embassy of Sudan here in Ottawa. And the question is effectively, how can Canada, but perhaps more broadly, how can other countries contribute to feminist foreign policy in Middle East in spite of cultural or religious differences? Any of the panelists wish to contribute on that question? I see Lyric, thank you.
Thanks. I'd be delighted to take a first stab at this. I think this is something that we've been very excited about, the evolution of feminist foreign policy, which did admittedly, in starting with Sweden in the European continent, run the risk of appearing to be a Northern or a Western tool. And it is only in recent years, since 2019, when Mexico announced, 2021, when Libya announced, and we've also heard an announcement from Chile and a few other countries in the MENA region that are looking at this. That, I think, has been some of the most exciting progress to me, is the clear demonstration that no region of the world has a monopoly on feminism, and that there are many feminisms, and that feminist foreign policies, of course, need to be adapted to unique context, but there are certain underlying universal principles, human rights frameworks, and the very powerful voices of feminist movements who are organizing in every country in the world around the same principles of people, equality, peace, planet, that we have distilled in our framework. We've also made efforts just in our publications to make those available in as many languages as possible, including Arabic. And so I'm happy to share some of those resources. But I think the trend line is very positive, and our work with feminist activists and academics around the world, including in that region, have quite a few, I think, useful answers to that question.
Great. With respect to the Middle East, anyone else wish to add on that question? Rollie, please go ahead.
Just briefly, I think it's a great question. And I'd just like to mention that I think international exchanges would be, I think, very helpful. I think often people could find very interesting in Sudan or wherever in the Middle East, that they may find very interesting to see by either visiting Canada or having Canadians visit there and having, or even online dialogues, but having interchanges on business, economics, security, culture, so forth, having these type of dialogues, I think can really help with women empowerment and understanding what options and what opportunities are available to people in these countries. Often they don't even understand all the opportunities that are available, such as microfinance on telephone apps, for women, things like that, all kinds of opportunities that are just, not necessarily advertised. And sometimes having that type of dialogue can help get these ideas out there.
Thanks, Rollie. Lucina? anything to add?
I think it was covered.
Perfect, thanks. Before we sort of move into the last portion of this this event, I wanted to give each of our esteemed panelists the opportunity to take 30 seconds or a minute to distill for us any of the key takeaways that they would like those of us participating to be left with today. Any thoughts or any additions to what you've said that you feel are important to convey to this audience? I'll start with Lyric.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be a part of the conversation. I've really taken quite a lot from fellow panelists' interventions. I've learned a lot, and that is my favorite part of this work, is the emphasis on sharing, collaboration, and learning. For me, I think if we were to distill our work on feminist foreign policy to a couple of key points, it would be that this work is universal, that any country can be feminist, and that the kind of core values or co-equal goals of a feminist foreign policy for us are people, peace, planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyric. Lucina.
Yeah, I think that we all think, probably at least the ones in this room, that women's rights are really the litmus test for democracy. And whenever they are being undermined, democracy is at risk. Over and over, we're seeing authoritarians and illiberal actors around the world using the same playbook and being very much facilitated by online tools that were designed in many ways with the profit in mind, and have proven to be very, very useful for some of the worst propaganda, some of the worst state-sponsored trolling and abuse. So I think it's really key to think about this dimension of the digital world, if you want, and digital policies as really being something that is streamlined across all kinds of different work. The truth is that unless we tackle gender disinformation, online harms against women leaders, we will not be able to be successful in the climate justice movement, because women leaders that are leading the fight on climate justice are being attacked over and over and over with gender disinformation campaigns that undermine their role. And again, we have seen it in Canada, unfortunately, that undermine their role, that undermine their political agendas. We are not going to be able to advance on immigration. In many countries, some of the strongest proponents in parliaments of human rights are the women politicians that are trying to really bring forward the rights of those that haven't had a voice for the longest time, and they are being undermined. And so we really need to look at the importance of tackling this issue across many different areas. And going back, to the feminist foreign policy, we will not succeed in making advances even with foreign aid and foreign assistance unless we look at how illiberal voices, anti-women's voices are using, the internet and are using the digital platforms to really strengthen their power. And in many ways harass their citizens. So it's really key that we look at this issue as, really being something that cuts across all kinds of sectors within the context of national security, within the context of foreign policy and foreign assistance. And it needs to be, I think, a lot more outspoken and clear, even in foreign policy and feminist foreign policy agendas that have, I think, lagged a little bit behind when it comes to this specific aspect.
Thank you, Lucina. And Rollie, please.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, kind of in connection to what Lucina is talking about, how platforms are leveraging these illiberal ideas are leveraging platforms. And I think one thing that I would like to emphasize is how much illiberal ideologies and norms need to also be looked at. Just these actual thoughts that are being, spread around the world, and to some extent how religion is being used in many ways to support illiberal norms and legal norms in many countries. And we need to look at that, because legal norms, even in Western countries that are considered liberal, are often underpinned by religious norms that are kind of our milieu that we live in. And to some extent, I think that's fine, but we need to make sure that those ideologies are moderate and promoting equality for women as well. And when they're not, we need to think, okay, how do we address these illiberal ideologies or extremist factions that are sometimes arising and that are very much trying to put women and minorities in a box? So the ideologies themselves need to be possibly addressed through education, through public information, through the use of possibly these self-same platforms to attack data voids, maybe, that are being very much taken advantage of by illiberal ideologies. So I think that we need to kind of hit this head on in many ways. Those of us who believe in the fact and the force of having a feminist national security and a feminist foreign policy and the importance of these things, we need to find ways of disseminating this type of information to combat strange ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Rollie. I think Ambassador Buck has a word or two as well that she looks like she wants to get. No, she doesn't. Okay, well then I'm going to do my best to try to quickly sum up so much of what we heard here is really so important. I will try to do my best very quickly. Rollie, you said one thing that I think is hugely resonant, and I'm sure not just for myself, but for everybody participating, and that is this paradigm shift to thinking about national security as security of the persons within the state and not the state itself. I think that is, it in some respects sounds so obvious, and in another way is so far from how we have traditionally at government levels and government to government levels engaged in this question and in these considerations. I personally have spent the better part of the last decade working in national security establishment in Canada. I can tell you that broader scope of these issues, the issue sets through a gendered lens, migration, security of women in particular, putting the gender-based analysis, gender-based plus analysis onto the way we consider these things is really relatively new, and in some cases completely unheard of. And I want to thank you for that, because I think everything that we've discussed actually flows from that shift in thinking, that shift in mindset to this broader, more holistic notion of how women's security needs to be at the center of the policy stream, and that needs to cross-pollinate across all policy streams. What you just said, Lucina, about there will be no success in aid or assistance until there is some reining in of how women engage online, and that women need to be free to engage online in that new, in what is now the public commons, and how women are being effectively being shut out of that space, that nothing will change, that democracy will not thrive until there is some recognition of that, the significance of that. These are truly really critical messages that you all have been delivering today. And I know that on behalf of the Parliamentary Center, we will be working to pull together all of these thoughts and continue to advocate and educate on these issues moving forward. But Lyric, Rollie, Lucina, thank you so very much for your time today and for all of the very, very meaningful learnings that we have gained and insights that we have gained and gleaned from the work that you do. Thank you for the work that you do every day. And thank you for being with us today. So with that, I will turn over to Gabrielle Bardal for the formal conclusion of the event.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that excellent summary of the event, Marcy. So much was said today, and it is such a vast topic. When we planned this event, we were overwhelmed, I would say, by the number of ways that we could approach this topic, because the feminist approach, it's a part of every area that we work on. And feminism is inseparable from democracy, just as it's inseparable from security studies, and looking at how they interact with each other and impact each other in this cyclical way is something that we really need to look at in a fundamental way as we look forward to how Canada is planning its future engagement, how the United States and other countries around the world that have represented on the call here today are looking at how they define both their security strategies and their democracy strategies. And for that, we are so grateful to have had all of you today as a part of that. We will be hosting more events as the part of this series. We are rounding the edge with just 3 events left of our year-long series. So please do look forward to more events in the coming months. And with that, Tom, would you like to say a thanks? You're okay? All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.